Ok, muchas gracias. Me hace muy feliz estar aquí con ustedes. Y lo siento que es necesario que hablo en inglés, pero entiendo mucho de su presentación.
Okay, good.
But it's true, I need to express myself in English with the help of my companion of the day, which is a Pacific Day octopus wearing a proper COVID cubrebroca, mascarilla, with Black Lives Matter and science is real and other important things. And you will notice that the eyes of the Pacific Day octopus are anatomically correct. They are not made cute as in a little child's toy. And so there's this octopus, which disappears into my background, is a kind of a ghost. So the monarch butterflies they fill a whole story in Seguir con el Problema. They are the heart of the Camille stories, the stories of the communities of compost, of the children of compost, of the children who are born into communities who find who take their being as work to help repair, to help heal the earth through a commitment, through having babies who are from fetal gestation on bonded to beings who would not survive unless responsibility for their future is taken. And the monarchs are symbiotically bonded to the character Camille. And Camille's cosmopolitanism is along the lines of flight of the butterflies, beginning from mountaintop coal mining removal country in the eastern United States, in the southeastern and eastern United States, and the great flyway across North America, across the southern part of North America, into Mexico, and finally into Mexico and Michoacan, and into the butterfly trees, into the Oyamel fir trees of the overwintering sites of the monarchs. Meanwhile, I live in Santa Cruz on the west coast of the United States, and the great western migration of the monarch butterflies overwinters in my town in Santa Cruz on the Monterey Bay. And these butterflies in turn fly north and fly into the west, into the deserts and mountains of the west. So two great streams of butterflies are at stake in this storytelling practice, which is a profoundly materialist storytelling practice. And it's about how, from finding a particular love, a love of the beauty of the butterfly, a love of seeing the flights of the butterflies as they arrive and in my town, come into the Monterey cypress and Monterey pine trees in Natural Bridges State Park. And in Michoacan and in Morelia, in the state of Mexico, the monarchs occupy the mountains, these amazing chain of volcanic mountains, but only very particular places, so that a tiny love has already brought my attention across North and South America, well, across North and Central, across North America, well into Mexico. And in following the flight, I follow the agricultural practices, the herbicides, the pesticides, the labor practices, the coal mines, the land of conquest, the exclusion of Native Americans from these lands, the working of these lands with immigrant coal labor, the working of many of these lands with slave labor, the move through Texas and Mexico across the border, across this extraordinary border of exchange of many languages, of many Spanishes, many Englishes, many indigenous languages in the Texas-Mexican border area. An area of crossing and of wall building and of rivers and of possibility and danger. Moving into the mountains of Michoacan, one moves through the efforts of avocado growers who have in recent years and recent decades given up their combination of corn and their own crops for the cash crop of avocados, sold largely in North America, in the United States, but also in alliance. These farmers are right on the edge of monarch territory, with an area of water catchment and conservation right there. And the various campesino, both indigenous and Latino, campesino towns, their crops, their water, their politics, their conflicts, the forest, the movement through that forest into the areas where the oyamel trees are, facing climate change, facing global warming, facing the impact of excess tourism, and also facing the murder of the conservationists. So that since I visited these monarchs myself in Morelia 2 years ago, this, in January in 2019, 2 years ago, I was in the butterfly territories in Michoacan. And the week before I arrived, one of the principal activists who worked to ally the farmers with the forest conservation, with the water politics, with the tourist businesses, a terribly important conservationist, was murdered. The following week, another conservationist, Mexican conservationist, was murdered. I know that just a few weeks ago, there were several more murders in this area and the closing down of the butterfly reserves. I also know that in my own town, very few butterflies have returned this winter. There are only a few dozen monarch butterflies this winter in my town, and there should be hundreds and hundreds of thousands. In the last 20 years, the migration has become very small. So I've painted much too quickly, but I've painted a picture of complexity, of connection, of responsibility, that if I take seriously a small love, loving to watch the butterflies in my town, that ties me. It ties me to their migrations, to the plants they need to feed their babies, to the farms, the agribusiness farms and the pesticides they use, to the land that has been taken by conquest and slavery, to the land under contestation for joint management agreements and sovereignty, the reinstitution of certain kinds of indigenous sovereignty across areas where these monarchs fly, into Mexico, across borders with peoples. If I'm going to take the butterflies seriously, if I'm going to, at the end of the day, be worthy of loving the butterflies, be on the way toward deserving, or I don't know, it's not a matter of deserving. If I am somehow to be able to say that it's true that I love the butterflies, if the truth is to be in the love, it's not merit, it's not deserving, there's a kind of truth. If there is a truth to loving the butterflies, then I, as a person in the world, need to be more in connection with other people, with people whose lives and deaths are at stake in the territory of these insects, to be more present to the histories, so that the present tense is both the living and the dead. It's both what is not yet and what has been. The present contains the temporalities. The present contains the times of the peoples, of the other organisms, the plants and the animals and the crops. It contains the problem of trans-mountain water transfer from the state of Michoacan to Mexico City. It brings me back to other concerns in this book about water transfer, this time not about the monarch butterflies, but about other lines of passage and lines of responsibility that move water from the Navajo Nation across mountains down to feed the cities of the Southwest, Phoenix and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, the water-hungry cities of conquest, and what that has done to the waters of the West, and the humans and the non-humans at stake. So the question is who lives and who dies in these passages, as you said in your presentation, and as well as how to connect, because no one person or group of people can do everything, but we can connect with others who are acting for a more livable world. We can connect with other loves and other lovers, and we can activate the practices. We can figure out, for example, in the state of Michoacan, there are some questions about whether to attempt some tree plantings at higher elevations so that the next generations of butterflies might be able to find conditions in which they can survive that aren't too hot during the winter. Or not. Is that a bad idea or a good idea? And which communities of practice have to be brought together to decide? Surely scientists must be involved, but so too must the tourism operators, the farmers, the conservationists, the foresters. There are the communities of practice that must be involved in making decisions for the well-being of those who live and die in these mountains are multiple. So I'm a visitor. I learn about these things. I have a little bit to offer. I learn way more than I offer, but I can also bring back what I learn to connect where I live, to connect around questions of immigration, questions of multi-species justice, including both people and more than people. I can connect, and I can connect my friendships and my colleagueships and my passions, so that I feel like I write as a kind of conduit, a kind of, that my writing is an act of lust to connect. It's a kind of being yearning to connect, and to connect through the details, through the actual living and dying, to connect to connect through what's real, to connect through the materialities and their significance, so that anything that I do in the way of theory grows out of this kind of relentless following the lines of the specificities.
Mm-hmm. It comes very clear into page as we read the book. I mean, all the effort that goes into really tracing every single detail and the complexity that comes with it. You've mentioned so far, I mean, you describe yourself right now as a visitor, as someone who was able to go to these places or invite people to come to your place also, you know, from these areas in Michoacan and Estado de Mexico to Santa Cruz and all that. And I had told you in our very brief conversation we had before we were right here on Facebook Live that I wanted to invite you to think about in what ways the COVID and the pandemic has challenging some of the methodologies you use in this book, because we cannot go, we cannot be visitors right now, right? What can we do meanwhile as we try to connect, desperately yearning for that connection that you mentioned? So for young writers who want to become, who want to write not about something but with our companion species, what can they do in these circumstances that are going to stay with us for quite a while? This is not just a passing fade. So have you, I would love to hear your ideas.
Yes, I think that this, I have, because we're all living this, we are thinking it because we are living it. We are thinking, feeling, and I think that I'm an old woman. I'm 76 years old. It's different for me. And yet I feel my social world thinning like gauze. I feel it, the fabric, the tissue of affective connection with other human beings is thinning like gauze. And of course, I and other people do everything we can to thicken it, to restitch it, to tie it together, to continue to embroider and to weave and to tie knots. And we do it through all kinds of things. We do it, of course, through things like Zoom, which allows people who would never be able to participate in the same event to participate in this event. We do lots of things which are also sensory to connect with each other, but also to hold the place open for maintaining the capacity to connect. Because I think holding ourselves open to be ready, I do think that this is a period of loss and suffering.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of other things are happening. I have the time to learn Spanish. Lots of things are happening. Okay. By the way, I spend a few hours a day studying Spanish. And I'm taking Spanish conversation classes with a woman who lives near Mexico City, actually, for 2 hours a week. Part of that is because the next time I come, I want to be less foolish. So there's a kind of building skills for what will come next that happen. They're very ordinary skills, learning another language. It's very ordinary. Also, there's the practice of getting all masked up and going for a walk on the beach with somebody else. It's not that we can connect carefully. We can talk, we can connect, we can't have everybody over to dinner and have that kind of thing. I can't have a seminar with young students and talk about writing and share papers, but we can have a speculative future writing workshop and share, the students can share each other's writing, comment on each other's writing. The materiality of living in Pandemia, this continent called Pandemia, which involves understanding something about virus justice. For example, we're watching the wealthy fractions and the wealthy countries buy up vaccines. We are watching the slowness of vaccination in areas that are more impacted by racism and extraction and exploitation and poverty and colonialism. We are watching virus injustice, if you will, vaccine injustice, virus injustice, coupled with an extraordinary ignorance about what viruses do. If you allow the numbers of organisms infected by a virus to grow out of control, the virus is in a banquet. The virus is having a fabulous time. It's evolutionary heaven. The virus can mutate and mutate and mutate and produce variant after variant after variant to defeat the vaccines, unless we practice vaccine justice. Unless everybody practices vaccine justice, the virus will kill hundreds of thousands more people, maybe more than it otherwise would have. Virus justice, vaccine justice, involves understanding that we need to limit the banquet that the virus has. Just keep it with tiny, stingy meals and make the virus hungry, okay? We will never exterminate the virus, and thinking in terms of exterminism is a really bad idea. It's a kind of nuke the enemy. No, figure out how to live in relative balance with this new virus and the others to come in such a way that we understand how the food markets, the wild and domestic animals, the human beings and different kinds of labor practices, different kinds of medical practices can live in relative balance on a wounded planet without the fantasy of immortality and killing death. Yeah. So I think that writers right now, my godson, who is 26 years old and has very strong visual and artistic practices, is out of work, was working in a grocery store, has been living at home with his mother, my dear friend and colleague, and has been doing a lot of photography and some very evocative writing that ties, that is, it's a kind of, he's a young man and he's chronicling his passage through this time in photography, in writing, in drawing, in collage. And he's lonely and he's hurting. He wants people, he needs people. The other folks his age need people more than I do. I have, they really, the damage done to youngsters is much more the damage done to the healthy elderly. I'm not talking about the elderly who are not healthy. That's a different issue. We have resources. So how I'm watching him transmute the trauma, not deny it, but transmute it into something material and artistically interesting.
Yeah.
And I think writers do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps challenging these preconceived ideas of what a genre is, and doing a lot of challenging, more radical work, in fact, if we want to embrace the world in which we live right now. I wanted to, I so much agree about vaccine justice. That's something that we need, virus justice as well. Every time that I open my Twitter feed in the morning, I come to face more and more people grieving for lost ones. That's the last questions the last question I'm gonna ask you, because I'm sure other people want to ask you something else. And in a way, you touched upon this already, but I was very moved by some of the early pages for your book, when you speak not only about learning how to live, but about learning how to die. And dying is something that we do with others. I mean, there is the work of the death, as Thomas Lacour talked about and documented so well. The wake work that Christina Schwab talked about in that book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. I've been talking for quite a while about grieving precisely as the type of work and practice that connects us with others in very extreme circumstances. And you speak about living with loss, right? Mm-hmm. Perhaps in a very similar way that you are describing this vaccine justice and this virus justice. We have to learn to live with this. And perhaps it would be just so fitting right now for you to speak a little bit about that, as many of the people who join us, I'm sure, are going through very extreme circumstances as well.
Yes. And in a couple of days, I will join a memorial for a colleague from San Diego, Leslie Stern.
Oh, no, really?
Died a few days ago, and I will send you the link.
Oh, I didn't know. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So it was not COVID, but
yeah,
a loss of a friend, a writer, a colleague.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also writing a blurb. Let me put my hand on this book. If I can. Yes. I'm writing a blurb. Wait a minute. Okay. Wake.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a graphic comic book by an amazing artist and writer and activist, Rebecca Hall, who was also an historian and a graduate student. And I was, in some sense, her teacher for some of the years that she was at UCSC. She writes this graphic novel about the wake, living in the wake. And she means the word wake, and I think this addresses the question of mourning rather than melancholia. She uses the word wake in all of its senses, including its Black African-American sense of being woke, wake, okay? Living in the wake of slavery, living wake, having a wake, having a ceremony of mourning, but so as to bring into the living the dead, so as to bring the dead into the living, but the living also into the dead, so that living and dying in connection with the extraordinary histories of women in slave revolts. The topic of this book is Black women in slave revolts, from the ships of the Atlantic slave trade to now in Black Lives Matter. The founders of Black Lives Matter are amazing Black women. Yeah. And Rebecca does this amazing graphic novel, which is about time, about revolutionary practice, about living and dying, about mourning, about taking in that which you can't take in because it's too terrible, but you must. And I think living in pandemia, living in times of COVID, taking in the weight of excess death. Dying is, it's not like an old person dying is unusual. It's sad, of course, but the weight of excess elderly dying alone in terrible circumstances where they cannot be held by those they love and those who love them. The weight of excess death and lonely death an epidemic, that infectious disease brings with it. Somehow taking that in so as to be more lively, not in the sense of some transcendental sense, but responsive to, able to feel with, so as to experience laughter and joy and sadness, so as to bear the weight lightly.
Yeah.
And surely living in time of climate destruction, climate change, in an era of extinctionism, extractivism and extinctionism. And there will be no going back to the state before. There will be no status quo ante, but there can be less damage. There can be new kinds of flourishing. There can be remembering old kinds of flourishing and inventing new kinds of flourishing amidst the destruction, so as to engage in partial healing, partial connection, so as to be, in a way, ordinary again. So as to be ordinary creatures among other ordinary creatures again, and not human exceptionalists.
Yeah, I very much appreciate your words. This idea that when we cannot aim for total healing, partial healing is okay. That's what we can do, right? And the love, when we are serious about love, when we claim to love something, it will take us to so many other places in this continuous material tracing of being. So I'll cherish that, and I'll keep that with me. Some of the things that have allowed me to go through this pandemic all these months have been reading very closely some thinkers from Latin America. Many of them, I think, speaking very much along your ideas of the common good, about collectivity and working with others. I've been reading, as I think many in Mexico, the work by a very young linguist, Yasnaya Aguilar, the work by Mije anthropologist Floriberto Diaz, the work by Gladys Tsutzul, the work by a plethora of young thinkers for whom the land is not a given, for whom the land and the way in which we relate to the land is a dynamic, a practice, and with its own agency, so to speak. So those are some of the ideas that I'm creating ideas with, the stories with which I'm telling stories about. And before someone else asks you questions, and I don't even know if I have time for that, but I would love to know, right now, Donna Haraway, who are you thinking ideas with? What stories are allowing you to go through these very challenging times?
There are probably several ways to answer that question, but I want to do it with this book.
Let's see.
Cattail Stories,
okay,
by Graciela Trevisan, who is Argentinian by origin. Okay. These are stories set in the town of Cattails in Argentina, where she was born. Okay. Written in English, published in English. I teach English as a second language to a migrant, a Spanish-speaking migrant woman in Santa Cruz. And these stories, she then will write, she will read a cattail story and write a story in English in response, which helps her remember her grandmother, her roots, her town in Oaxaca, that helps her connect to her daughters. She's writing these absolutely extraordinary stories in response to Graciela's stories. Mm-hmm. And then I take Cecilia's stories and send them to Graciela, and then take from Graciela some of her references to South American thinkers. For example, the singer and composer Violeta Parra, the Chilean singer, mm-hmm. who occurred in one of these stories. So I watched this in Spanish, beautiful animated claymation and embroidered animation of the biografía de Violeta Parra,
yeah.
Cantar con Sentido, la biografía de Violeta Parra. And so I watched this amazing 20-minute Spanish language animated, poetic. The prose is sheer poetry. It's really amazing. With her music in the background, while for English lessons, Cecilia is reading Graciela's transmutation of her Argentinian childhood into English. So I am thinking with Graciela and Cecilia and the characters of this story and the kind of magical realism that Graciela draws on in order to write her stories. So it's a tiny little book, and it's very simple, okay? But it helps me think with a whole company of women whom I need right now.
A labor of love too, right? The serious love.
Yeah.
Amor correspondido.
Sí. Sí, gracias a la vida también.
Virginia, I think this would be a good time to get some questions from, I bet you have many of them.
Hola, sí, de hecho sí hay muchas preguntas. A ver cómo nos organizamos. A ver, llegaremos a lo que podamos. Una disculpa si no podemos hacerlas todas. Voy a intentar irlas leyendo. I'm going to read the questions. Hay varias que preguntaban sobre qué estaba leyendo Donna actualmente y también Cristina. Creo que ya Donna ha contestado un poco con estas referencias del comic Wake, de Cattle Stories. But I don't know, Donna, if you want to add some of your recent readings. Y en esta de las lecturas también preguntan si Donna ha leído Esferas de la Insurrección de Sueli Rolnik, esta teórica brasileña. Y esa sobre las lecturas. También otra relacionada con lecturas preguntan a si Donna se considera bióloga, if you consider yourself as a biologist. And if you know the work of the French Edgar Morin, what do you think about it? Si quieren, avancemos con estas y luego seguimos con algunas más.
That's for you.
The first one, and then we can continue maybe.
Yeah, two questions, but I think of myself as a biologist, but I've never done experimental work in biology, so I'm a very poor biologist. But I read and I maintain connections with colleagues, and it influences what I write and do profoundly. I write and think and live and act as an organism, as a biologist. I care about the biology and I translate it for my friends all the time. So that's to the first question. The second question, repeat the second question again.
It was more about your readings. I think it's something that you have mentioned during the conversation, no? With these two references that you mentioned, but especially if you know the work of Sueli Rolnik.
I don't, I should.
Okay, and a work that it's about Esferas de la Insurrection Spheres.
No, I don't, but I would like to. So that person should send me an email.
Okay. Okay. No sé si Cristina quieras comentar tú algo que estabas también leyendo, que era una de las preguntas también.
Bueno, yo algunas de las cosas que he estado leyendo las mencioné en mi introducción, porque conforme iba leyendo el trabajo de Donna, como es tan poroso y como ofrece tantos puntos de contacto, iba acordándome de cosas, ¿no? De autores. Mencioné recientemente este trabajo de Christina Sharp, In the Wake, que me pareció fundamental. Tengo mucho tiempo leyendo a Fred Moten, su poesía y sus ensayos. Recientemente acabo de leer el libro de Silvia Federici, que me parece una escritora fundamental, pero del reencantamiento de lo real. Y me encantaría, no sé si Donna conoce el trabajo de Yasnaya Aguilar y de Floriberto Díaz, but and I think Yasnaya's work is being translated into English, just a couple of articles, but I just see so many connections between Yasnaya's work and your ideas about connection and working with others and you know what, all that we've been talking about. So I'm going to ask her to shoot you an email too.
Good.
Okay. Pues si quieren voy con alguna más. Esta es un poco larga. Dice, la leo primero en español y luego intentemos traducirla. Dice, ¿qué opina Donna de las críticas que se han hecho desde el feminismo afroamericano, como Zakiya y Man Jackson, a la propuesta posthumana. ¿Qué opina de los grupos subalternizados y racializados que han sido bestializados desde la perspectiva antropoeurocéntricas? ¿Y qué sugiere que primero habría que humanizar a los deshumanizados? ¿Y qué opina de las etnografías multiespecie como las desarrolladas por Deborah Bird Rose y las humanidades medioambientales? ¿Las siente más cercanas que el ejemplo de perspectivismo amerindio de Viverius de Castro? I'm trying to translate because I think it's a complex question and with many questions at the same time. What do you think, Donna, of the critics that they have been made through the Afro-American feminists like Zakiya Iman Jackson to the post-human proposal? What do you think of the subaltern groups racialized and that have been make peace from the perspective of the Eurocentric, anthropo-Eurocentric? What do you suggest that has to be humanized first to dehumanize? And what do you think about multi-species ethnographies like the ones that have been developed by Deborah Bird? Do you think that are closer to the perspectivism from Viveiros de Castro? I don't know if I'm clear.
De Castro. That's a very complex set of issues. First, I have never considered myself part of posthumanism, though I have a kind of alliance. Posthumanism can be understood in many, 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 many ways. It can be understood as a kind of slash through the exceptionalism of humanism, a kind of revaluing of what it is to be a human being among other beings, and so on. But I've always preferred to work and think in languages other than the theoretical languages of posthumanism for reasons that aren't too different from the critiques made by people like Saadia Hartman and others. I think that I want to work myself and read others who work historically and experientially from different idioms that are rooted in different historical experiences, which do not exclude the Euro-Atlantic, for example, or the Anglo-North American, or what have you, or the Australian colonial settlers, who have produced some amazing, remarkable thinkers, feminists among them, people I don't want to live without. But I want to think more and more with and through with the writers like Kim Tallbear, like Joanne Barker, like Kealawe Kawanui, like many others, and also the ethnographers like Eduardo Cohn, but Viveiros de Castro and Deborah Danowski too, and their students, Juliana Fausto and others. I am not strict about sorting whether drawing from one area or another is legitimate. I am completely promiscuous. And I'm yearning, I read the biologists who work in the areas of multi-species interactions through the developmental history and the ecological history of a group of organisms, because I need what they're doing to relate to the earth, okay? I need to be reading, there are now, as there have always been some, but now there are a lot of Indigenous writers from many different kinds of communities and many different kinds of places. And it would be a terrible mistake to talk about an Indigenous perspective. But now there is printed scholarship, printed fiction, podcasts, video productions, film, you name it. It is now irresponsible not to become more and more literate in the many productions of Indigenous thinkers from all sorts of areas and situations. And I don't think, posthumanism is not necessarily a bad thing, but it has not prioritized that project, I think. Some people who think of themselves as posthumanists do. I think Rosi Predati does, for example. But I don't find the formation itself it doesn't privilege that kind of learning and thinking and reading with that I want to be more actively doing. Okay. I think that answers your question a little bit about ethnography too. Ethnography is of course a colonial practice, but what isn't? It is also more than a colonial practice. It is not nothing but a colonial practice. And ethnographers have entered into an extraordinary array of alliances and critical rethinkings and reworkings. And ethnographic practice, I think, is a domain, including feminist multi-species ethnographic practice, which does not just act like a kind of kidnapper and kidnap another species. That one cannot write a multi-species ethnography by analogy or by kidnapping the consciousness of another, etc. How? What would be the materiality of writing, thinking, feeling, reporting that which is not human? There's no answer to that because it's a permanent searching, a permanent task. And the minute one thinks as a specificity matters, and I think we are in multiple connection with both human beings and other than human beings. It's not that we are, we don't have to sit in our closet all by ourselves and imagine what it is to be a dog. We are in actual relationships with real dogs. And we can write and think and speak from that, including ethnographically. What we can never do is claim to know the other, including the other human being, and for that matter, the other of oneself. That kind of search for a kind of non-dogmatic ethnographic investigation into life on Earth. So yeah, I like multi-species ethnographies, particularly the ones that don't make them speak English or Spanish for that matter.
Thank you, Donna. There are several questions referred to the idea that make kin, not babies. Comentan, ¿nos podría hablar un poco más de su idea make kin, not babies? Y dicen, por ejemplo, el parentesco multiespecies es una oportunidad de curar la pandemia del terror desatada por el COVID, o how multispecies justice is connected with other ways of making.
Yeah, the make kin, not babies gets me in lots of trouble, of course, because it so easily falls into the racist, eugenicist practices of white supremacy. And so I have tried to be very careful and at the same time not deny the weight of humanity on the planet, and especially the weight of wealthy humanity, the cost to the earth of wealthy humanity, of wealthy human beings having their 1 and 2 and 3 babies, what that costs to the earth to engage in what I think of as excess reproduction of the wealthy first. And also the problem of numbers that are not just the question of the wealthy, and that people all over the world are themselves already addressing. For example, the birth rate of human beings has fallen all over the world. People make their reproductive decisions in relation to their socio-ecologies all over the world, including fewer babies, practically everywhere, except in some super extracted, super exploited areas. That's way too simple. But the question of numbers of human beings, I think, is one that must be addressed, but addressing it is almost impossible because of the history of racism and eugenics. That's the first thing. The other thing is that I think multi-species environmental and reproductive justice must be the practice. That means human beings and other than human beings, multi-species environmental and reproductive justice. So that in the cities, by the way, I find basically, for example, Red Deal, the Native American Indigenous Red Deal, which is a tremendous enlargement, and other than the Green Deal, takes very seriously environmental justice in a multi-species way, takes very seriously the relationship of peoples, indigenous peoples' relationships with the more than human as the normal way of being. So that multi-species environmental and reproductive justice is not, the ideas and the practices are not going to come probably principally from the Euro-Atlantic axis. There will be contributions, of course, but the principal insights about multi-species reproductive and environmental justice are already coming from peoples who are reclaiming their lives and their relationships and reproductive capacities with other than outside Euro-Atlantic domination. It's way too simplistic, but it's a start.
Thank you. And I think it's going to be the last question, a menos que tú, Cristina, quieras comentar algo, pero ya me están apretando con los tiempos.
Adelante.
Dice, ¿qué opinas, Donna, de la propuesta pero me parece que es interesante esta pregunta. ¿Qué opina de la propuesta de la red de sanadoras ancestrales que se teje desde el feminismo comunitario territorial y los saberes recuperados desde la voz de mujeres como Lorena Cabnal y su vínculo con el cuerpo y con la memoria?
Give me some English so I don't misunderstand.
Yeah, what do you think of the proposal of the net of the ancestral, ¿cómo diríamos, sanadoras?
Healers.
Healers.
Mm-hmm.
That nets from the territorial communitarian feminism, from the ancestral knowledge, from the voice of the woman, like Lorena Cabnal, and the link with the body and the memory.
Yeah. Well, it's better than the Christian God. I don't want to be dismissive. I have a very large soft spot for the traditions of women healers, for the traditions of the witches in their material practices, for example, in European traditions, and other practices of healing and spirituality and community healing of the land. And I am allergic to ways that, at least in my receiving it, in my understanding, a kind of appropriation of indigenous ideas and representing them as a kind of feminist communitarianism too easily, much too easily. Losing the complexity of women's practices and indigenous practices, both by women and by men in many areas of the world, both contemporary and past, and a kind of, I don't know, I have a tendency to be allergic, even while I think the work is important. And I know communities of practice, for example, women farmers, who are engaged in this kind of work that I think is pretty amazing and for which I have large respect. I just think it's complicated, and that I have a certain allergy to what seems to go toward, maybe I was vaccinated against religion at a certain point, having grown up a very serious Catholic for many years, and I worry about that.
Thank you for the answer. It was a complex question.
They're not easy. It's not simple.
Yo creo, I think maybe we can close here. Invitaría a Sara y a Ekaterina a sumarse, aunque sea virtualmente, aquí en imagen. No sé si Cristina quieras decir algo para cerrar.
I just want to thank Donna for her time and energy and sharing, making world with us right now through this Zoom connection. And I'm so happy, I'm thrilled to be part of this celebration, la llegada de esta editorial a México, estos libros preciosos que esperamos que circulen mucho y que conecten mucho y que nos ayuden a crear otro presente más habitable, más hospitalario. Muchas gracias a todos por la invitación y gracias a todos los que estuvieron aquí y gracias a todos los que tuvieron que trabajar para hacer esto posible.
Sí, y mí también. Gracias a todos.
Gracias a ustedes por esta presentación.
Y Cristina.
Gracias a todos.
Me toca decir que vayan por sus libros, pero también decirles que he estado muy conmovida por la plática en muchos momentos. Thank you, Donna. I have been moved by your words and by Christina's words along this conversation. So thank you very much. Y sobre todo también gracias a Consoni por la confianza y pues estamos en librerías. Búsquennos.
Las ediciones son preciosas, las recomendamos mucho también. Gracias.
Gracias por venir a México, Donna. Un abrazo a todas.
Las editoras. Gracias.
Gracias.